stretches. Yet the clearness and the joy of the spring day were not in the village. They were somewhere outside the village, where there were no people, in the fields, the woods, and the mountains. In the village the air was stifling, heavy, and terrible as in a nightmare. Gabriel Andersen stood in the road near a crowd of dark, sad, absent-minded people, and craned his neck to see the preparations for the flogging of 7 peasants. They stood in the thawing snow, and Gabriel Andersen could not persuade himself that they were people whom he had long known and understood. By that which was about to happen to them, the shameful, terrible, ineradicable thing that was about to happen to them, they were separated from all the rest of the world, and so were unable to feel what he, Gabriel Andersen, felt, just as he was unable to feel what they felt. Round them were the soldiers, confidently and beautifully mounted on high upon their large steeds, who tossed their wise heads and turned their dappled wooden faces slowly from side to side, looking contemptuously at him, Gabriel Andersen, who was soon to behold this horror, this disgrace, and would do nothing, would not dare to do anything. So it seemed to Gabriel Andersen, and a sense of cold, intolerable shame gripped him as between 2 clamps of ice through which he could see everything without being able to move, cry, or utter a groan. They took the first peasant. Gabriel Andersen saw his strange, imploring, hopeless look. His lips moved, but no sound was heard, and his eyes wandered. There was a bright gleam in them, as in the eyes of a madman. His mind, it was evident, was no longer able to comprehend what was happening. And so terrible was that face, at once full of reason and of madness, that Andersen felt relieved when they put him face down on the snow, and, instead of the fiery eyes, he saw his bare back glistening, a senseless, shameful, horrible sight. The large, red-faced soldier in a red cap pushed toward him, looked down at his body with seeming delight, and then cried in a clear voice, "Well, let her go, with God's blessing." Andersen seemed not to see the soldiers, the sky, the horses, or the crowd. He did not feel the cold, the terror, or the shame. He did not hear the swish of the knout in the air, or the savage howl of pain and despair. He only saw the bare back of a man's body, swelling up, and covered over evenly with white and purple stripes. Gradually the bare back lost the semblance of human flesh. The blood oozed and squirted, forming patches, drops and rivulets, which ran down on the white, thawing snow. Terror gripped the soul of Gabriel Andersen as he thought of the moment when the man would rise and face all the people who had seen this broad body out in the open and reduced to a bloody pulp. He closed his eyes. When he opened them he saw 4 soldiers in uniform and red hats, forcing another man down on the snow, his back bare just as shamefully, terribly, and absurdly, a ludicrously tragic sight. Then came the 3rd, the 4th, and so on, to the end. And Gabriel Andersen stood on the wet, thawing snow, craning his neck, trembling and stuttering, though he did not say a word. Dank sweat poured from his body. A sense of shame permeated his whole being. It was a humiliating feeling, having to escape being noticed so that they should not catch him and lay him there on the snow and strip him bare, him, Gabriel Andersen. The soldiers pressed and crowded, the horses tossed their heads, the knout swished in the air, and the bare, shamed human flesh swelled up, tore, ran over with blood, and curled like a snake. Oaths, wild shrieks rained upon the village through the clean white air of that spring day. Andersen now saw 5 men's faces at the steps of the town hall, the faces of those men who had already undergone their shame. He quickly turned his eyes away. After seeing this a man must die, he thought. 3. There were 17 of them, 15 soldiers, a subaltern, and a young beardless officer. The officer lay in front of the fire, looking intently into the flames. The soldiers were tinkering with their firearms in the wagon. Their gray figures moved about quietly at the black thawing ground, and occasionally stumbled across the logs sticking out from the blazing fire. Gabriel Andersen, wearing an overcoat and carrying his cane behind his back, approached them. The subaltern, a stout fellow with a mustache, jumped up and turned from the fire and looked at him. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked excitedly. From his tone it was evident that the soldiers feared everybody in that district. through which they were scattering death, destruction, and torture. "Officer," he said, "there is a man here I don't know." The officer looked at Anderson without speaking. "Officer," said Anderson in a thin, strained voice, "my name is Michelson. I am a businessman here, and I am going to the village on business. I was afraid I might be mistaken for someone else, you know." "Then what are you nosing about here for?" the officer said angrily, and turned away. "A businessman," sneered a soldier. "He ought to be searched. This businessman ought, so as not to be knocking about at night. A good one in the jaw is what he needs." "He's a suspicious character, officer," said the subaltern. "Don't you think we'd better arrest him? What?" "Don't," answered the officer lazily. "I'm sick of them, damn 'em." Gabriel Anderson stood there without saying anything. His eyes flashed strangely in the dark by the firelight, and it was strange to see his short, substantial, clean, neat figure in the field at night among the soldiers, with his overcoat and cane and glasses glistening in the firelight. The soldiers left him and walked away. Gabriel Anderson remained standing for a while. Then he turned and left, rapidly disappearing into the darkness. The night was drawing to a close. The air turned chilly, and the tops of the bushes defined themselves more clearly in the dark. Gabriel Anderson went again to the military post, but this time he hid, crouching low as he made his way under the cover of the bushes. Behind him people moved about quietly and carefully, bending the bushes, silent as shadows. Next to Gabriel, on his right, walked a tall man with a revolver in his hand. The figure of a soldier on the hill outlined itself strangely, unexpectedly, not where they had been looking for it. It was faintly illumined by the gleam of the dying fire. Gabriel Anderson recognized the soldier. It was the one who had proposed that he should be searched. Nothing stirred in Anderson's heart. His face was cold and motionless, as of a man who is asleep. Round the fire the soldiers lay stretched out sleeping, all except the subaltern, who sat with his head drooping over his knees. The tall, thin man on Anderson's right raised the revolver and pulled the trigger. A momentary, blinding flash, a deafening report. Anderson saw the guard lift his hands and then sit down on the ground, clasping his bosom. From all directions short, crackling sparks flashed up, which combined into one riveting roar. The subaltern jumped up and dropped straight into the fire. Gray soldiers' figures moved about in all directions, like apparitions, throwing up their hands and falling and writhing on the black earth. The young officer ran past Anderson, fluttering his hands like some strange, frightened bird. Anderson, as if he were thinking of something else, raised his cane. With all his strength he hit the officer on the head, each blow descending with a dull, ugly thud. The officer reeled in a circle, struck a bush, and sat down after the second blow, covering his head with both hands, as children sometimes do. Someone ran up and discharged a revolver, as if from Anderson's own hand. The officer sank together in a heap, and lunged with great force head foremost on the ground. His legs twitched for a while, then he curled up quietly. The shot ceased. Black men with white faces, ghostly gray in the dark, moved about the dead bodies of the soldiers, taking away their arms and ammunition. Anderson watched all this with a cold, attentive stare. When all was over, he went up, took hold of the burned subaltern's legs, and tried to remove the body from the fire, but it was too heavy for him, and he let it go. 4. Anderson sat motionless on the steps of the town hall and thought. He thought of how he, Gabriel Anderson, with his spectacles, cane, overcoat, and poems, had lied and betrayed 15 men. He thought it was terrible, yet there was neither pity, shame, nor regret in his heart. Were he to be set free, he knew that he, Gabriel Anderson, with the spectacles and poems, would go straight away and do it again. He tried to examine himself, to see what was going on inside his soul. But his thoughts were heavy and confused. For some reason it was more painful for him to think of the 3 men lying on the snow, looking at the pale disk of the far-off moon with their dead, unseeing eyes, than of the murdered officer whom he had struck 2 dry, ugly blows on the head. Of his own death he did not think. It seemed to him that he had done with everything long, long ago. Something had died, had gone out and left him empty.